this region. I had a lot of fun creating Torry, and I'm excited to create the next one, so stay tuned. I grew up in Ohio, about 60 miles south of Toledo, and maybe about Fort Wayne, Indiana. And that was like, I don't know, fourth grade, I think. The local town was having a card party to benefit the library. And they just opened it up to grade school kids and said, create a publicity poster for it, and you'll win a prize if you can get the winning entry. So they liked mine, which was pretty much just a recreation of a a playing card. But that was a big deal because that was the first time I ever got a check. Somebody paid me something for creating artwork, and I kind of got that first glimmer of, well, maybe this is something I could do, in my future. Eventually I moved down to Tennessee. I got a job at a publishing house that published a lot of magazines. I was an art director there, and that's pretty much where I learned how to work professionally with editors and copy editors, professional photographers and illustrators, and really learned the ins and outs of publishing. My very first book was called Fast Friends, and that's kind of a cool story. I kind of backed into creating children's books. It wasn't really my plan to do that, to create children's books, because my background is in graphic design and illustration, but I've always loved the combination of words and pictures. Anyway, Dr. Seuss had just died, and Random House was looking for a new talent to create books. And they wanted to find somebody that could both write and illustrate. And what they were asking was, you had to write a manuscript for a 32-page picture book. You had to mock up the entire book with sketches and then do 3 finished pieces of artwork for your entry. So I had, I don't know, I guess maybe 6 months to do that. A coworker had told me about this contest, and she said, why don't you look into it? You've mentioned a couple of times that, maybe it could be kind of a cool thing to do as children's books. And so I created the story about a cow and a chameleon, and how, kind of trying to teach kids how, people who are different can get along. They can form friendships and learn how to treat each other with respect. And much to my surprise and chagrin, in a way, I won this contest among 1,200 entries. So they awarded a publishing contract and $25,000 with the plan, I guess, of, that money could encourage, or you could leave whatever job you had to create this book. But I wasn't about to do that because I needed the health insurance. So, but anyway, so in my spare time, I worked with the editors at Random House and the art director, and we worked together. I learned how to work with them. That was pretty cool, and finished the book, and that came out in 1994, I think. Yeah, 1994. So that was my first step. Like I said, I kind of backed into it. I got very lucky. I have no qualms about admitting that. I mean, I know how hard it is to get into publishing. And really, when I look at it now, I think, okay, I won this, but I had to kind of learn what everybody else was learning to get into publishing. I had to go kind of step back and learn about how to create a good story, the steps that are important to that, how to pace a story, just all these things. So anyway, after that book, a couple years later, I met with Great Smoky Mountains Association, and they were interested in starting a children's book publishing program there. And they wanted to create a book about salamanders for kids. And so I created a story for the Great Smoky Mountain Salamander Ball and illustrated it. And that kind of led to a really wonderful relationship with that nonprofit organization. I created some other books outside of the National Park System, but I also did a book for Mount Rushmore Association. I illustrated a book for an Olympic cyclist. So it's been really interesting and varied career. So we come to now, Torry in the Land of Arches, and how that story was developed. And I'll just take you through some of the steps. We knew we wanted to create a story about a wolf mouse because they're just these intriguing characters, and they just have this very interesting, almost cat-like way of hunting. And they're just cute, little guys, but they're also very fierce. I started by thinking of who the characters could be in the stories. I started with Torry, the main character. It was a kind of a timid mouse. We never get to why he only has one eye. That's the whole mystery of the thing. But it was some kind of trauma that made him a very timid, kind of scared mouse, scared to try new things. So he goes on a visit to his grandparents at Arches, and they encourage him to, try new things, become more courageous and such. But these are character sketches, initial character sketches that I did for these three main characters. I know I wanted Grandpa Ed to have kind of a more Western feel with the bushy mustache and the cowboy hat, and I knew I wanted the grandmother to be kind of a spicy Southerner, with a really strong backbone. To the left is one of the initial manuscripts for the book before we came up with the title. When you think about a 32-page picture book, often the way I start is to write it out actually with a pen on paper. I don't type it out immediately because it's just a way to get the ideas flowing. I don't really try to structure it immediately. It's just the idea of getting ideas flowing, getting things going, and then I'll just go back in and start fine-tuning. Just the way you would with a lot of projects that you work on. You start big and then you get smaller and smaller. So on the left is each spread. I started thinking about what could be discussed and shown for each spread, how it could be paced for 32 pages. And actually, the book grew to 48 at some point because of the way the story progressed. We didn't want to have too much text per spread because that's intimidating for little kids, and they get bored. You just don't want to sit there and stare at the same picture for minutes on end. Something else that I often do is on the right side of the screen, I'll do layout notes. Per spread, I'll think about what I want to show for each character, important visuals that should be included, any character traits that I need to keep in mind as I move on. Okay, and these are thumbnail sketches for the book. These, pretty much nobody really sees these. They're very small, initial ideas of how I envision the story to unfold. This is another important step in pacing the book, seeing how shapes can interact together as the book proceeds. I knew I wanted to create this book with a technique I have used before. These are technically stop animation puppets. This was a puppet I created for the first book I created in this style with a steel ball and socket armature that is machined. I bought a kit to do that. I can't do it myself. I don't have that kind of skill, but a lot of times when stop motion animation, armatures are usually coated with like clay, something like that, or foam or something, some sort of material to hide the armature skeleton. I decided to choose wool felting. And what I do is I coat the armature, I'll wrap the wool felting, the wool strings around the armature, and then I'll take the felting needle, which you can see in the middle photo, and just stab the wool repeatedly until it turns into felt. The third image that you see up there is one of a character that I created at one point, where I created the costuming. A lot of times I'll just sculpt the head with the material called Sculpey, which is just a polymer clay where you sculpt whatever you want, and then you bake it in the oven, and that hardens it, and that's that. It's very simple. And I'll add color digitally. Sometimes I've created some with colored polymer clay, but I just, oftentimes I like the subtler colors that I can get if I create something digitally. This was the initial armature for Torry, and you can see how I create a sketch, first of all, on tracing paper, the image to the left, figuring out how the armature will work. This particular armature is done, I think that's just like what did I use, like a tin can or something. I cut it down into this little square shape and glued it onto the puppet, and the eyes, the different shaped eyes, would just snap onto that little metal piece. Let's see. So you can see how in the middle photograph, I found this, it's like a weird glue polymer that when it dries, it still has some flex to it. So I experimented with that, because the pink stuff, and created little claws that I inserted into the gooey stuff, and let it dry, stay in place, because I didn't want to put the armature back in the oven again with the wool felting on there already. You can see the beginnings of the felting taking place on the head. Things just gradually starting to grow. I considered leaving that kind of fun tuft of hair on Torry's head at some point, because I just thought he looked so punk. I thought it was so funny. And then I was just kind of like, well, no, okay. And I just felted it down and just kept him pretty standard. You can see some detail from the feet here. I wrapped some of the wool felting around the little toes, and then you take a larger piece of wool felting and wrap it around that, and then you take the felting needle and stab the wool, and then it just kind of keeps everything in shape, and everything is still bendable and posable and flexible.
So how many stabs do you have to do to get it to
it
do
depends.
what you want?
It depends. You can use different size needles. Some will felt faster than others, but yeah, it actually was kind of restful to do, because it was that was a pretty stressful time in my life. There was other stuff going on, so it was kind of therapeutic in a weird way to do it that way. But you can see, what the image in the middle, is a much simpler eye and mouth, and then the image on the right is, his eye popping out. I experimented with using thread for his whiskers, but I just couldn't get it right. The threads were just too thick, and I just thought, this isn't working out, just do the thread digitally. And that seemed to suffice. All right, so one of the characters in the book, of course, is Jackrabbit Slim. And I wanted to keep his size pretty much in proportion to the wolf mice as much as possible. But so he is created also with a wire armature, a little bit simpler than the ones I did for the mice. And he's padded with foam first, and then wrapped with the wool, and then felted, building up layers and layers of color. He was actually the most fun to do. I guess it was because of all the color he had in the ears and the texture and things like that. But you can see how things slowly progress to the far right image of where he's posable and bendable and everything else. And so it actually looks kind of ominous there, doesn't he? Okay, and now we have the villains of the story. With the scorpion, I found these small, flexible wooden snakes online, and I thought, well, maybe that could be a base for these puppets, so they could still be posable. because what I do is, after I create the puppets, I photograph them and then digitally superimpose them on a painted background. So what I did was I took the wooden snake, covered it with the polymer clay, and actually threw that in the oven for a little while. It didn't seem to hurt the wood, and attaching wire armature. Eventually built that up with more polymer clay, and the sculptable gluey stuff that it kind of turns rubbery after it's dry. And it was kind of funny. I kind of ran out of that stuff after a while. It came in a whole range of colors, and I didn't really want to order more. So I thought, well, I can mess with the color digitally. It's not going to be that big of a deal, but it kind of looks kind of cool this way. Scorpion, and then the giant centipede, which was, it looks like a kid's toy, doesn't he, with his bright primary colors. Built up kind of the same way. I used the small wooden snake. Created these almost like tubes out of polymer clay that were about, I don't know, maybe like an inch long. And then baked those first and then attached them to the wire snake, so it could still be posable and not, rigid. You can see Grandpa Ed in the background with his hat. I felted a hat. I found I was trying to figure out how I could make a cowboy hat, because for some reason I just got in my head I wanted to see if I could do it. So he was formed, I think I ended up using a light bulb, or maybe I just created a piece of polymer clay that seemed like it was the right size, and then formed the hat with wool felting around that. So that was fun. All right, so after the puppets are created, I start thinking more about tightening up how these background images are going to be painted, and start, as I progress and start finishing the paintings, I just put them in place so I can keep track of my progress. So you can kind of see in some of these, those are the images that look like without the puppets superimposed. The digital process is done with Photoshop. I usually use like a combination of watercolor brushes and oil paint brushes. I don't use filters very often because I find that it tends to make a lot of digital artwork look the same, and I don't want that. I want to recreate something that actually looks like it was painted with watercolors, but I like the freedom of painting digitally because if you screw things up, it's much easier to fix instead of starting all over again. So, for example, I picked a spread to show you the progress. The first image is a tight sketch with how I envisioned the puppets would be posed and how the background would be painted. The second image is the actual digital painting without the puppets in place. And then the third image is after the puppets are photographed, posed and photographed, and fit and lit. So there's a lot of thinking ahead that you have to do before, especially with lighting. And especially with this book, because it took place at night since Wolfmeister Nocturnal, I was kind of concerned that it was going to be a dark book, and I tried to create interesting light and color where I could. And here we have Jackrabbit Slim. This is another example of a puppet that's digitally superimposed on the painted backdrop. And stay tuned for further adventures, because the next book, Canyonlands, will star our Jackrabbit Slim, who owns a taxi service. So Jackrabbit Slim will be getting any guests that visit the park much more quickly from location to location in Canyonlands, because it's such a huge park, obviously. So, does anybody have any questions for me, or?
So is that a definite now? As far as Jackrabbit Slim?
I would really like to, at least with one of the characters anyway. We talked about Jackrabbit Slim, and then, maybe a river character joining up. So Torry may or may not make an appearance. We don't know yet, but it's still very much in the early stages. You know, this visit was all research and development.
So, like, back to the previous slide.
Oops.
Oh, well.
Never.
Where you had, you started with the sketch and then went to the painting and then the photography. Like, how long does that, like, that one step for that one page take?
That's kind of hard to gauge because,
Yeah.
she's magical.
She is magical.
Well, we have to do this, we do the sketch stage, do all the sketches in place, and then I discuss things with Sam about, are the sketches working, and also Roxanne, how is everything working correctly? Is there anything missing? Does this look like the right direction we want to be going in? So that's like the first stage, and that's, probably second longest stage. The shortest stage is actually doing the digital color painting backgrounds, I would say. That's, I don't know, it's really hard to say because I don't do them all at once.
Well, yeah, so let me rephrase. So once you get to the puppet stage and photographing it, how long does that take?
Photographing the puppets takes a bit of time. I have to be really organized, and I have to really know how I'm going to pose these guys. And I'm not a photographer, so I have to really spend some extra time making sure everything is in focus and making sure everything is lit the way I want it to be lit.
So what's your platform? You have like a little light stage? I mean,
it's just this little light tent because these guys aren't very big. I mean,
right.
with Jackrabbit Slim, I really had to cram him in there a little bit, but I was still able to pose him. So yeah, it's a collapsible white light tent. I experimented with photographing them on blue screens, but that didn't work as well for me as just photographing them on a white background. I don't know. I guess it's just because I'm more used to getting rid of white backgrounds in Photoshop. It's my background. It's that, and then set up the tripod and the camera, and just.
Do you do each puppet individually?
It depends. Sometimes if they're interacting, like if the puppets are riding on Jackrabbit Slim's back, I'll pose them all at the same time. Oftentimes I couldn't, so I think sometimes I could get him on Jackrabbit Slim's back and photograph them that way, but it didn't always happen. The space was kind of tight, and those guys were hard to kind of keep on his back. Yeah, I've been doing it a long time. I mean, I've been doing it since they started, but I have my own methods. It's like, they over the years, they've created so many shortcuts and stuff and everything, but I already have my own way of doing it. And, not to say that I don't learn new methods that they bring about and stuff. They do some really great stuff, but again, I don't want my stuff to look like everybody else's.
Right.
And I don't want it to look like it's digital. Try to stray away from that.
Well, I had no idea until you had sent me the Sabrina book, and then after the fact, you had told me that they were puppets. And I was just like, oh my gosh, how does she even do that?
Well, it's funny. A lot of times I'll get people asking me, well, are you going to make a movie out of that? Are you going to do stuff like that? I'm like, kind of, because that's really
Claymation.
Yeah, it sure is. It really is. And really, these puppets are, especially the twisted wire puppets, aren't really meant to, they go through a lot of stress when I'm photographing them. And Torry's got a broken arm. I have to take him apart and, retwist the wire and refelt.
You poked his eye out.
I did. It was me, and I'm glad. But, Yeah, it would be really cool to see them come to life, though. I mean, I'd love to try it at some point, but you know, the puppets would just have to be built differently, and, you know, I don't know, those ball and socket armatures are just way beyond my skill set, because it's, you know, you have to know how to machine them, and I built some that were made out of brass, and that took some time, but they're not as sturdy as those steel ball and socket armatures. But
Cool process.
thanks. Yeah. Something to do, so we can get in trouble, right? Yeah.